Welcome to Hidden Front History. We are diving deep into the true stories that change our understanding of conflict.
Yeah, not just the battles won or lost, but, the profound, almost impossible internal wars fought over principles and human dignity.
And today, we are placing you right in the middle of a scene of just visceral shock.
San Francisco, September 1945. The war in the Pacific is officially over, but the psychological warfare, the conflict that really matters, is just beginning for a very small, specific group of prisoners.
We've put together a stack of sources detailing the arrival of 43 Japanese women who had steeled themselves for death, for torture, for vengeance.
But instead, they were met with something far more shattering, unforeseen compassion.
Okay, let's unpack this opening, because the sheer weight of expectation these women carried is, well, it's the foundation of this entire deep dive.
It really is.
So imagine this scene. It's foggy, it's gray, the salt spray hits the scarred hull of the transport ship arriving in the bay.
And on that deck, you have 43 women standing in two rigid lines.
And these aren't frontline combatants.
No, not at all. They're nurses, civilian workers from military hospitals in the Philippines and Okinawa, radio operators, clerks. Their ages range from 19, that's our youngest source, all the way up to 45.
And they're filthy. Their uniforms are just rags. Their hair is matted.
And you have to understand their journey to get here. It didn't start in San Francisco. It started with their capture in Manila way back in March.
Right.
They spent 6 months in a succession of these makeshift holding areas, bombed out schools, crowded island camps, sleeping on cold, damp concrete floors.
But the defining feature of those 6 months, the constant physical reminder of their status,
Were the chains. Heavy iron chains bolted around their ankles.
His source material is just relentless on this point, the psychological message those chains sent.
Oh, absolutely. They were more than restraints. They were a persistent statement of dehumanization.
They were told constantly, and the medal confirmed it, that they were the enemy, they were prisoners, and crucially,
Less than human. That message was the only certainty they had.
and we have to recognize the conditioning that went with that physical bondage.
Imperial Japan's wartime ideology, often summarized by the tenets of Bushido, it demanded not just relentless aggression toward the enemy.
But total unflinching stoicism in the face of defeat.
Exactly. Their highest virtue was to die with dignity, to show no weakness, and certainly to give the enemy nothing, no satisfaction.
So they were prepared for monstrous treatment. It's what their propaganda promised, and it's what their side had often delivered.
The tension is just palpable as the gangway lowers. They're expecting sounds of fury, screaming, spitting, vengeful GIs.
That is the only logical response in their trauma-conditioned minds.
But they're met with a violation of their conditioning before they even set foot on American soil.
The initial sensory details here are they're essential. The fog is rolling in, the ship clanks, the chains drag.
But the first thing that registers to Ko isn't a threat. It's not an aggressive sound, it's a smell.
The strange and almost forgotten smell of fresh, yeasty bread drifting in from some distant bakery on the dock.
Think about that, you. The smell of life, of normalcy, of a daily routine that has just continued, uninterrupted. For a stomach that's known only scarcity and the metallic tang of fear for months, that scent, it makes Ko's hunger clench into a physical pain that's almost unbearable.
And that scent of normalcy is immediately contrasted by the visual shock.
They shuffle down the gangway, their chains clanking a sound that, it should be met with rubble and ruin, the landscape of total war they'd left behind.
Instead, they see an intact city. Skyscrapers standing tall, glass windows reflecting the bay, cars moving quietly, people walking to work in suits and dresses.
The difference between the destroyed cities they had left, the ashes of Manila and the craters of Okinawa, and this thriving, undamaged city felt fundamentally wrong, like a trap.
It just refuted every single piece of propaganda they had internalized.
Instantly, this site confirmed right away the true scale of their nation's defeat.
Yet despite that shock, their internal state was defined by this rigid discipline.
Keiko, the older head nurse, the one who tried to maintain order, she had drilled the mantra into them. Do not show weakness, do not cry, die with dignity if you must, but give them nothing.
They were prepared to die, but they were not prepared for the enemy to recognize their humanity.
That preparedness for cruelty was their last psychological defense.
And that takes us to the source, highlight, and our mission statement for this deep dive. We are looking at a conflict between expected cruelty and unforeseen compassion and what that revealed about both sides.
And our task here is to unpack the moment that defense mechanism was decisively shattered.
Let's move now into Section 2, the unthinkable act of dignity. This is the pivot point of the entire story, and we really need to slow this down and examine it.
Okay, so the American soldiers line the dock. One steps forward. A sergeant, older, with graying hair, a man who had clearly seen enough of war to be tired of it.
And he looks at them, not with the anger or hatred they anticipated, but with an expression Ko later writes she simply did not understand.
The sources are very specific about his actions. First, he speaks to his fellow soldiers in English, presumably issuing a firm command about how to behave, ensuring respect.
And then he approaches the line and pulls a ring of keys from his belt. Keys.
Not a weapon, not a rope, keys.
And then he kneels down.
Sachiko, the older nurse, is the first woman in line, and Ko, watching this, is just utterly stunned.
In their cultural framework, a person of status kneels only to a superior or in an act of profound submission.
Right. So why would an enemy soldier, a victor, kneel before a Japanese prisoner? It was an act of profound, conflicting respect, a total reversal of the power dynamic they expected.
The source material says he put the key into the lock on Sachiko's ankle chain. The lock was stiff, rusty.
There was a grinding sound, then a sharp metal clank, and the shackles fell away onto the concrete.
That sound must have just been deafening in its finality.
And he didn't rush. He moved down the line, slow, deliberate, taking time for each woman.
To Ko, the lock on her ankle was particularly stiff, and he had to try twice before it turned.
When the chains finally fell away, the absence of their weight was so sudden, so profound, that she records in her notebook that she almost stumbled.
It was a physical and psychological release so overwhelming it was destabilizing.
It was the literal removal of the identifier of their dehumanization. The physical pain from the chafed skin, which they had been conditioned to ignore, was nothing compared to the shock of the metal just vanishing.
And then came the words that crystallized the entire event.
The sergeant stood up and in halting, heavily accented Japanese, which suggests he had rehearsed this, he had prepared for this moment, he told them, "You are prisoners of war, but you are human beings. You are not animals. We do not treat people like animals."
This is the centerpiece of the deep dive. We have to analyze why this statement was so uniquely destructive to their ideology.
The sources repeatedly call the moment frightening, and you have to ask why. Because their entire psychological defense, their ability to endure, was predicated on the idea that they were facing monsters.
You can hate monsters. You can defy monsters.
Exactly. But when the enemy affirms your humanity, the entire framework collapses. It forces them to see themselves, suddenly, as human subjects deserving of respect, making their forced dehumanization suddenly visible.
And what about the American perspective? You mentioned the Geneva Convention earlier. These women were technically military-aligned civilians, not uniformed combatants, which complicates their legal status a bit.
It does, but that's where the institutional context is so crucial.
Yeah.
The sergeant wasn't acting purely on personal empathy, though I'm sure that was there. He was enacting established American military policy.
Right.
The U.S. military had clear codes of conduct for treating POWs, stemming from a commitment to the principles laid out in international law. This act was a declaration of who the U.S. chose to be. It was drawing a moral line in the sand.
So it's saying, regardless of what atrocities our enemy committed, we will not sacrifice our own principles.
That's it, right there.
And Ko, the young nurse, she records feeling something crack inside her chest. It wasn't the horror they had expected, but a terrifying, unfamiliar concept, grace.
They no longer knew the rules of the game, because the rules had just changed from brutality to dignity.
And the immediate follow-up reinforced this. They were loaded onto trucks without chains, driven through San Francisco, catching glimpses of normal life, children on bicycles, women pushing baby carriages, the sound of laughter.
And that normalcy, juxtaposed with the pain of their raw ankles, made their previous existence feel impossible, like a nightmare that had actually been real.
This psychological shift takes us seamlessly into Section 3, the process of humanization.
They arrive in a military facility that doesn't smell of fear or filth, but of antiseptic and soap. And who greets them? American nurses in clean white uniforms, red crosses, and they smiled.
The sources describe Keiko, the stern, older nurse, immediately suspecting a trick, a cruel trick.
Of course. She had seen too much. She assumed the benevolence was just a prelude, a refinement of torture. And that suspicion isn't malice, it's a trauma response.
They just can't accept it, because accepting it requires them to discard the entire survival narrative they'd spent 6 months building.
But the cruelty never materializes. Instead, they're taken to examination rooms. American doctors, men and women, check them over professionally. checking for injuries, noting malnutrition, looking for diseases common in crowded camps.
And we get that specific, powerful detail when Ko winces as a doctor touches her badly bruised ribs. The doctor immediately stops and apologizes.
Think about the weight of that apology. It's a recognition of individual pain over political status. In the system they came from, pain was to be endured for the glory of the empire. Here, their individual physical pain mattered to their enemy.
They received medications, bandages, and a thick, cooling ointment for the raw skin where the chains had been.
The record notes that the nurse who dressed the infected cut on Ko's arm did it with such careful, almost tedious attention that Ko felt a painful rush of tears she had to instantly suppress. Crying was still a betrayal of Hyoko's ironclad mantra.
The next stage of cleansing is so deeply symbolic. The shower.
The shower revelation, yeah. They were led to a facility, not one open room, but individual stalls, each with a curtain for privacy.
That provision of privacy alone was monumental.
In the camps, they had been stripped bare, exposed, treated as a collective unit. Here, they were granted the personal space and dignity of an individual.
Privacy, clean water, and real soap that smelled like flowers, not harsh industrial lye.
And Ko, under the stream of hot water, a luxury she hadn't dared dream of, finally lets herself release the tears she had held for 6 months. She watched the water run brown at her feet before clearing.
It's washing away more than just dirt.
So much more. It's washing away the grime of fear, the sweat of the camps, the physical manifestation of her subjugation.
And the transformation afterwards was both physical and psychological. They emerge clean, they receive simple, clean cotton dresses, socks, and Kansas shoes that actually fit.
And Ko looks in the mirror and barely recognizes herself. She notes she looked almost human again.
That phrase, almost human again, is just devastating. It confirms how deep the feeling of dehumanization had run.
And this leads to this moment of collective realization. Yuki, tear-stained but clean, asks Ko the crucial question that just articulates the cognitive break they're all experiencing. Is this real? Or have we died, and this is some kind of afterlife?
She literally couldn't process the benevolence within her framework of existence.
But the real gut punch, the most profound moment of ethical reckoning, comes not from the younger women, but from Etso, the older, more experienced nurse.
Etso had witnessed the realities of war from the Japanese side.
Right. And she looks down at her clean hands, the professional bandage on her arm, and speaks aloud about the terrible, well-documented treatment of American prisoners by Japanese forces, starved, beaten, tortured.
And she contrasts this reality with their own experience. Clean clothes, hot water, professional medicine being called human. I mean, for a person steeped in that culture of victory or death, how deeply does that moment pierce the armor?
It shatters the armor completely. Etson's question, posed to the silent group, is the first true step toward accountability. She asks, what does that say about us? About what we allowed to happen? This wasn't just a political defeat anymore, it was a moral one. The external treatment forces them to critically assess their own nation's behavior. They realize they are safe, healthy, and clean, precisely because the enemy chose to uphold a principle that their own side had discarded.
That moment of silence, the weight of that question, it brings us directly into Section 4, where the sheer abundance they encounter just amplifies that guilt and confirms the full, crushing truth of the defeat.
They're led to the dining hall. It's warm, brightly lit, casual. American staff are eating at other tables, chatting, nodding occasionally, but there's no malicious surveillance, no hostility.
Contrast this with the crowded, filthy feeding areas of their recent captivity, where food was sparse and often rotten.
Here, they're given actual trays, cutlery, cloth napkins.
And the food itself becomes the overwhelming evidence of America's impossible victory. The sources detail the feast: hot, fluffy white rice, grilled fish, steamed vegetables.
Fresh bread and real butter, the source of that yeast smell from the docks. Fruit, apples, and oranges, so bright they looked unreal. Coffee and milk.
And the server tells them, quite casually, to take as much as she wanted.
Ko is described as trembling as she takes only the tiniest portions, terrified that if she took too much it would be snatched away, or that it was a trick, that it was poisoned.
They huddle together, just staring at this unimaginable quantity of food.
Their initial reaction isn't gratitude, it's a profound emotional paralysis. Yuki starts crying again. Hyoko grips her fork so tight, her knuckles turn white.
And when Ko finally takes a bite of the rice and the sweet, fresh buttered bread, the taste is familiar and warm and so heartbreakingly good.
The eating process becomes a study in trauma and deprivation. Initially slow, they then eat faster than desperately.
The source material records that painful anecdote of the one woman who vomited violently from eating too quickly after months of near starvation.
And yet she immediately wiped her mouth, took another deep breath, and continued eating. The desperate primal drive for survival just overrode everything else.
And the moment Ko bites into the crisp sweetness of a fresh apple, something they hadn't seen in years, it triggers sharp, painful memories of her childhood village, her mother's smile, autumn festivals.
Because the intact city, the overwhelming casual abundance of butter and apples and milk, spoke a truth they had been told was entirely impossible. Japan had lost the war, completely and unconditionally.
They had believed, even during their capture, that the Americans were weak, running out of resources, desperate.
And the reality of San Francisco refuted every piece of that propaganda.
The new rhythm of captivity just cemented this reality. It replaced the chaos of war with a confusing sense of normalcy. They wake to a bugle, but not harsh shouts.
They're assigned light work, laundry, gardening, or in Ko's case, sorting books in the library. And there were no beatings for working slowly. There was just this quiet expectation of a simple human routine.
And that's where the human element breaks through again, through the anecdote about Mrs. Henderson, the librarian.
A middle-aged civilian who spoke no Japanese, but she patiently showed Ko how to organize the files. And she brought Ko these small, personal, almost unnecessary gifts. Tea with real sugar, a single bar of chocolate,
And a worn book of Japanese poetry she had found in storage.
Her message, conveyed through a translator, was, "I thought you might like something from home."
And this is such a critical detail, isn't it? It's not about providing basic sustenance. It's about acknowledging the prisoner's past life, their cultural identity, their humanity.
It's an act of preserving their identity, not erasing it. An act of deep respect. And it's an early signal of American soft power, treating the defeated not as subhumans to be crushed, but as potential future allies whose culture must be respected.
But the kindness and the safety they experience create this immediate, crushing juxtaposition when the letters from home finally start to arrive weeks later.
The emotional consumption of the abundant food instantly curdles into profound guilt. Yuki reads her letter describing her family eating tree bark and insects to survive, while she, the POW, had just finished a plate of pot roast and apple pie.
The juxtaposition is just unbearable.
The letters confirm the Emperor's broadcast, the unconditional surrender, and the physical safety and well-being of these women stood in stark opposition to the national ruin and the starvation of their families. The guilt was crushing.
It made their own survival in clean cotton dresses feel like a deep moral betrayal.
And this profound psychological burden sets the stage for Section 5, which explores the triumph of principles over vengeance. It's easy to be kind to the powerless. It's much harder to maintain that kindness when you know exactly what cruelties that powerless nation has inflicted.
Our sources acknowledge that some Americans were hostile, people who had lost sons or husbands and whose anger was real and justified.
But the focus remains on the consistent institutional humanity shown by the staff. Sergeant Williams, the man who removed the chains, he checked on them regularly. Mrs. Henderson, despite the profound personal loss of her husband at Pearl Harbor, still brought Ko gifts and poetry.
And Private Johnson, the young guard, trying so earnestly to learn a few Japanese phrases, though his pronunciation was apparently terrible.
It embodies that awkward, earnest effort at basic human connection. These small daily acts just relentlessly chipped away at the massive propaganda structure the women had carried.
The incident where Ko stumbles and scrapes her knee is so deceptively simple, but it holds the key to the whole principle.
Private Johnson rushes to help her, genuinely worried, and insists on taking her to the infirmary. And Ko, trying to make sense of this utterly baffling behavior, asks him in halting English, "Why kind?"
And Private Johnson's answer is the purest distillation of the principle at work. It bypasses any political or historical context. He just says, because you're a person, you got hurt.
That's it. No discussion of victory, no mention of ideology, just the simple recognition of shared human vulnerability.
Let's delve deeper into the connection between Ko and Mrs. Henderson. Ko specifically confronts her, expressing her guilt. How can you be kind? Your husband, I'm sorry, I am Japanese.
And Mrs. Henderson's reply provided an entirely new, radical philosophical framework for Ko. She reframes the entire conflict. She says, "You didn't kill my husband. War is the enemy, not you, not me, just war."
This perspective that the mechanism of conflict itself is the primary enemy, not the individual participants, was entirely foreign to the Japanese ideology of the time.
Which demanded the total hatred and erasure of the enemy.
But how realistic was that philosophy for soldiers and civilians who had just fought island by island, facing unspeakable brutality? Does the source material give any indication of the internal struggle the American staff faced?
The internal struggle is implied by the very need for the formal rules of conduct. Sergeant Williams, for example, had to be the enforcer of that principle. The sources note he had to pull aside a few younger, more vengeful soldiers who had fought in the Philippines, and remind them of the institutional standard.
So the principle wasn't easy. It was constantly reaffirmed by command. That kindness wasn't just idiosyncratic, it was policy.
And the level of medical care they received further illustrates this. Yuki received advanced antibiotics for an infection. Sachiko had complicated dental procedures. And Michiko was sent to a specialist to reset her arm properly so it would heal correctly, even though the Japanese medic in Okinawa had simply told her to endure the pain.
Michiko's reaction, recorded by Ko, is crucial. She cried not from the pain of the resetting, but from the crushing realization that her enemy cared more about her long-term health than her own military hierarchy had.
The Americans used expensive, scarce resources simply as a matter of course because the prisoner's fundamental human right to health wasn't in question. It was an investment in the enemy's future well-being.
As the weeks turned into months, Ko began her private, dangerous struggle, chronicled in her small notebook. She starts questioning the entire structure of Japanese society.
Her entries reveal immense turmoil. The cognitive dissonance is just tearing her apart. She writes, "I believed we were fighting for survival against monsters, but I am here now, in the heart of America, and they have not destroyed me. They have healed me. How do I reconcile these two truths?"
It's the ultimate test of loyalty, not to the emperor, but to truth itself.
And the questioning extends radically to gender roles. She observes the American women, Miss Thompson, the English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, the nurses, who work, make choices, speak their minds, and are treated with respect, even equality, by the men.
Which directly challenged the Japanese ideal that a woman's highest purpose was to serve and obey, to be silent and endure.
Khan speculated in her notebook about the true nature of the war. Is that what we were really fighting against? Not just American military power, but American ideas about freedom and individual worth.
She realized their nation's restrictive ideology was its own form of weakness.
And the internal conversations among the women reflect this cracking certainty. Hyoko, still clinging to pride, demanded to know why the Americans were being kind if they were not weak. And Sachiko offered the radical suggestion. Maybe they are kind not because it benefits them, but because it is right. Because their principles demand it.
And the final, undeniable affirmation of that principle came in December, with the approach of the Japanese New Year.
The base chaplain, astonishingly, arranged for a traditional observance. He found rare ingredients for mochi, decorations, and helped set up a small, temporary shrine.
Finding mochi ingredients, that wasn't charity, it was respect for culture.
Precisely. This act of honoring their traditions was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a statement. We are not trying to erase you, your culture, or your identity. We are only fighting the political regime that used you.
And Carr realized this was the exact opposite of what Imperial Japan had done to the prisoners and occupied peoples they controlled.
The recognition was devastating. Japan had not just lost the war, it had lost its honor by failing to uphold basic human principles. The kindness itself became the ultimate force leading towards self-accountability.
And as we move into Section 6, this painful psychological transformation reaches its devastating climax with the external confirmation of the truth, the Tokyo war crimes trials.
By early 1946, the women were physically recovered, healthy, and clean. But internally, they were in the midst of this necessary moral transformation.
Ko's notebook entry from this period is the thesis statement for their experience. The chains were never the real prison. The real prison was what we believed. The Americans did not break us by being cruel, they broke us by being kind.
Then, in February 1946, during breakfast, the soft radio music in the dining hall stops, and the bilingual staff translate the broadcast. Details of Japanese atrocities were being presented at the Tokyo war crimes trials.
Mass executions, torture, medical experiments, the brutalization of prisoners and civilians across Asia.
The details were horrific, incomprehensible to the women, even after months of ideological deprogramming. But this led to the final, devastating realization.
The American soldiers and staff in that dining hall, eating their breakfast and serving their prisoners fresh coffee, they knew all of this.
They had always known what Japanese forces had done, the cruelty, the disregard for human life, yet they still chose dignity and mercy.
This is the cognitive dissonance in its purest form. They were being fed and cared for while simultaneously learning their countrymen committed unspeakable acts, and the people feeding them knew this all along.
The distinction, the conscious choice to adhere to their own values regardless of the enemy's actions, was the most powerful lesson of all.
Overwhelmed, Ko walks out to the compound fence and confronts Sergeant Williams, the man who had removed her chains.
And she asks him directly, in her newly improving English, the question that burned away all her remaining loyalty to the old system. Why? Why you kind? We enemy, our people did terrible
And
things.
Sergeant Williams delivers the moral centerpiece of this entire deep dive, the definition of principle.
He tells her, what your leaders did, what your soldiers did, that was not you. And even if you had done terrible things yourself, we still have rules. We follow these rules not because the enemy deserves it, but because we do. Because that is who we choose to be.
The principle was self-defining. It was not a reaction to the enemy's behavior. It was a nation saying, we will not become monsters to fight monsters.
We will hold to our values, our dignity, even when the enemy has not done the same. And Ko's subsequent notebook entry affirmed this lesson. The measure of a civilization is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies.
But the transformation brought a new, heavy burden. By March 1946, they learned they were going home.
And instead of the joy you might expect, they felt profound fear. Fear of the ruin, fear of starvation, but mostly fear of not fitting in anymore. They couldn't unknow what they had learned.
When the ship finally entered Tokyo Bay in June, the devastation was beyond imagination. Fields of rubble, skeletal people.
Ko's reunion with her mother, who was skeletal and wore rags, underscored the impossible gap between the prisoners' safe, well-fed captivity and the suffering of the homeland. Their survival felt like a deep moral complication.
Her mother listened to the story. The kindness, the bread, the clean dresses, the removed chains.
And when she learned that the Americans had treated her daughter well because they followed a specific set of principles, she simply said, we were told so many lies. I am glad you survived. I'm glad you learned the truth, even if it hurts.
Ko, using her nursing experience and her new English skills, found work at a makeshift clinic set up by the American Occupation Forces.
But she immediately faced hostility from Japanese patients who had internalized the wartime propaganda. When she tried to share her story of humane treatment, some called her a liar or a traitor.
But some, particularly older women who had endured the privations and the lies, listened with desperate attention.
One elderly woman gripped Ko's hand, urging her, tell him the truth, not the propaganda. Tell him exactly what you saw. We cannot rebuild on lies. We tried that, and look where it brought us.
And Ko took that message to heart. She eventually became a teacher and rebuilt Tokyo, teaching English and history. She persisted in telling the true story about the defeat, the atrocities committed by the Imperial Army, and her time as a prisoner saved by principle.
She understood that accountability was the only path to national healing. Her ultimate message, drawn from the deepest point of her painful experience, was the legacy she passed on to her students.
The strongest weapon is not guns or bombs or soldiers. It is principles. It is choosing to be civilized even when your enemy is not.
It is treating people with dignity, even when they have not earned it, because that is how you define yourself.
She faced constant criticism, being called pro-American or a traitor, but she knew that Japan's future depended on facing the truth she had learned on American soil.
She lived to be 93 years old, passing on the lesson that the Americans defeated us with bombs and soldiers, but they won us over with principles and dignity. Never forget that difference.
The physical chains were melted down long ago, but their impact remained not as a memory of bondage, but as a symbol of transformation.
The sound of chains hitting the ground became the sound of awakening for those 43 women. They had expected hatred and found principle, and that forced them to rebuild their internal world completely.
The story of the 43 Japanese women POWs is such a powerful illustration that the measure of civilization, whether national or personal, is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies.
The kindness shown by those American personnel, the provision of food, clean water, medical care, and dignity, all guaranteed by institutional principle, was the force that ultimately led to accountability and honesty, which was essential for the democratic rebuilding of Japan.
It was an investment in the enemy's humanity and ultimately an investment in future global stability.
This deep dive shows us that principles matter most precisely when they are hardest to follow.
Right. When faced with overwhelming anger or justified retribution, it is incredibly simple to choose hatred and vengeance. It feels natural. But what does it truly take in those moments of greatest conflict to choose dignity and principles over that simple, powerful impulse toward hatred?
It is a question that defines us, regardless of the conflict, and a lesson that transcends history. We hope you take this story with you as you reflect on the choices that define humanity and civilization.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into hidden front history. We'll see you next time.